One of the most relevant mitzvahs to us during the calendar, the part of the calendar that we find ourselves in right now, one of the most relevant mitzvahs in the parsha is, of course, the mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer. Now you have a very basic question which the Rishonim are troubled by when it comes to the psukim in this week's parsha that relate to Sfiras HaOmer, and that is that there seems to be a stira, a contradiction in the very words of the psukim. Take a look at the psukim. The pasuk says, "Usfartem lachem imacher as hashabbos, miyom haviachem as omer hatnufa, sheva shabbosais timimois tiyena." 7 full weeks one must count. Seems to be a clear mandate, mitzvah deraisa, to count 7 weeks. Ad mimacher as hashabbos hashviyis tisperu chamishim yoim veikravtem mincha chadasha laHashem. Then the pasuk continues to say, you're going to count these 50 days. And of course, the problem is that it doesn't take such a high-level mathematician to realize that 7 weeks is not 50 days. 7 weeks is 49 days. So how could the pasuk in one breath tell us to count 7 weeks? Seemingly, that is 50 days. What do you mean? 7 weeks is not 50 days. Am I counting 7 weeks, or am I counting 50 days? So this question is raised by Tosfos. Tosfos in Maseches Menachos is bothered by this question. He gives 2 interesting terutzim, and it's seemingly the thrust of what Tosfos is trying to argue is probably what many of you are thinking right now, and that is that what the Torah means is count 7 weeks until day 50, right? Ad v'loy ad bichlal is a lashon in one answer of Tosfos. V'loy ad bichlal nun yoim. But v'krafta mincha chadasha. Tosfos is just saying what the Torah means is you count 7 weeks until the 50th day. But of course you don't count 50 days. You only count 49 days. The Reikeach has a very, very strong mashma'os that he would disagree with this Tosfos, and the Reikeach seems to indicate that in fact he holds we do count 50 days. Tosfos is saying we only count 49 days, and the Torah only requires 7 weeks, which is 49 days. And when the Torah says 50 days, it doesn't really mean 50 days, it means until 50 days, which means to count 49 days, and that's our minhag. The Reikeach would seem to indicate that that is not the case. The Reikeach holds seemingly that we in fact do count 50 days. We count 50 days. Says the Reikeach, we don't count 50 days. Well, we sort of count 50 days because in Tefillah, in Kiddush, when we're Mekadesh, the Yom Tov of Shuas, of course, Nichlal in the Yom Tov of Shuas says that it's the day 50, but one is actually being Mekayim, the mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer would sound like, according to Reikeach, the final stage of mitzvah Sfiras HaOmer is the 50th day, and through that a person, through the Kiddush, through the Tefillah, a person is Mekadesh Shavuos, he is counting day 50, and that is a part of Sfiras HaOmer. So seemingly a machlokes rishonim, but the problem still remains, according to the Reikeach. If we're in fact counting 50 days, the Torah seems to be a contradiction. How could the Torah say count 7 weeks? The Torah then goes on to say 50 days. If you're going to tell me like Tosfos that it doesn't really mean 50 days, so 7 weeks mean 49 days, and therefore everything is good. But according to the Reikeach, I'm counting 50 days and I'm counting 7 weeks. What's going on over here? Is it 7 weeks or is it 50 days? So to fully understand this, we really have to take a step back and have a discussion which we've had in the past, and that is a much broader conversation when it comes to the mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer Bizman Hazeh. We know that there is a major machlokes amongst the Rishonim whether Sfiras HaOmer Bizman Hazeh is Mida Araisa or only Mida Rabbanan. The Gemara brings the Shita of Ameimar, which seems to say that even though Mitzvah L'Mimnei Yamei, Mitzvah L'Mimnei Shvuei, says Ameimar, but I only count Yamim. Why? Because Zeicher L'Mikdashu, Zeich L'Mikdash. And Tosfos understands, as many of us would understand the simple pshat in the Gemara, that Ameimar is coming and saying that the mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer Bizman Hazeh is in fact only a mitzvah mi de Rabbanan. That's why Tosfos argues one could count bein hashmashos, because it only results in a suffix de Rabbanan L'kula, it's a suffix d'Rabbanan l'kula, because the whole mitzvah bizman hazeh is only a mitzvah mi d'Rabbanan. Many Rishonim agree with Tosfos, but there are those that disagree. Most notably, of course, the Shita of the Rambam. The Rambam holds very clearly that the mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer bizman hazeh is in fact still a mitzvah de'araisa, seemingly disagreeing, holding like Shitas that disagree with a meimer. So the Rambam holds it's a mitzvah deraisa bizman hazeh, and Tosfos holds it's a mitzvah derabanan bizman hazeh. Now, what is the fundamental Yesod point of which they are arguing upon? So it would seem, as the Achronim explain, that they are arguing about a very, very basic understanding of the mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer. See, if the mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer is, as you would, the impression that Psukim would give you, Pshutay Shel Mikra, so the mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer is really to connect two karbanos, the karban HaOmer, which is brought on Pesach, and the karban of the Shtei Alechem, which is brought on Shavuos. Therefore, the mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer is connecting the karban HaOmer to the karban to the Shtei Alechem. It would therefore follow, says Tosfos, that when I have karbanos, there's a mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer. If I don't have the karban HaOmer, and I likely won't have the Shtei Alechem, but I certainly don't have the karban HaOmer. I didn't bring karban HaOmer. So what am I counting from? What am I counting to? Why am I counting at all? This is part of the halachas of Beis HaMikdash. We are not mekayim the karbanos, so we shouldn't be mekayim the prat within the karbanos. Therefore, says Tosfos, that's our Meimer's argument. That Bizman Hazeh, of course it's not the Araisa Bizman Hazeh, it's merely Midarabanan, because the Karbanos aren't here, and the Svira is a detail within the world of Karbanos, no Karban, no Svira. So why are we counting? Omar Meimer comes and says, no, we still do a quasi-counting, Zeichel Mikdash. It says Zeichel Mikdash. So a machlokes between Tosfos, who clearly holds is connected to the karbanos. So where does the Rambam disagree? The Rambam seemingly understands that no, there's more to the counting than just the karbanos. You're counting to the Yom Tiv of Shavuos as well, even if there are no karbanos. I'm not merely counting to know when to bring the Shtei Alechem. I am counting because part of the counting is bringing me to the Yom Tov of Shavuos. Perhaps, if you will, the Rambam would argue it has to do with, as we know, the Sefer Chinuch writes, what's the whole Yesod, Misharshei HaMitzvah? What is the Misharshei HaMitzvah of the Mitzvah Sfiras HaOmer? What does the Rambam tell us in the Moreh Nevuchim? It's all about Matan Torah. Clearly, they understand, even on a Daraisa level, even though it's not the simple understanding of the Psukim, but even on the Daraisa level, there's an understanding that the Mitzvah Sfiras HaOmer is not only about karbanos, but it also has to do with Matan Torah, also has to do, if you will, with the Yom Tiv of Shavuos. So yes, it could be that there are no karbanos, but says the Rambam, still we count Mida Araisa, because counting is not just about karbanos. Counting is about Hishtoikekus, Ksifa, as the Sefer Chinuch writes, as the Rambam writes in Moreh Nevuchim, towards Matan Torah. And yes, even though it could be that there's no karban Bizman Hazeh, but Matan Torah, the Kabbalas HaTorah that Klal Yisrael will have to experience and therefore prepare for, that certainly there is, and therefore even Bizman Hazeh, says the Rambam, the mitzvah Sfiras HaOmer is in fact mi de o raisa. Machlokes Tosfos and the Rambam, the raisa de Rabbanan, seemingly dependent on what you hold the basic, most fundamental, primary reason behind the counting is. What's intriguing is the shita of the Rabbeinu Yerucham. Rabbeinu Yerucham, one of the Gedolei Rishonim, of course, seems to have a fascinating opinion when it comes to this. Does he say it's daraisa? Yes, but not really. Does he say it's darabanan? Also yes, but not really. Well, does he say it's daraisa or darabanan? What's going on over here? Says Rabbeinu Yerucham, seemingly, yes, there's parts of it that are as a mitzvah daraisa, and there's parts of it that's a mitzvah mi de rabbanan. Rabbeinu Yerucham seemingly holds, and this seems to be the position of other Rishonim as well, perhaps the Chizkuni, perhaps Rabbeinu Hillel on the Teres Kohanim. The Rabbeinu Yerucham seems to hold that really there are two mitzvahs over here. There's the mitzvahs of counting the Shavuos, the weeks, and there's a mitzvahs of counting the days. And normally we understand, like the Gemara says, mitzvah mimni yoyim, mitzvah mimni Yeshua, we normally understand it's one big mitzvah. Rabbeinu Yerucham actually understands these are two independent mitzvahs. There's a mitzvah of Shavuos, and then there's a mitzvah of Yomim. And then Rabbeinu Yerucham goes further and he says, the mitzvah of Yomim is still midaraisa bizman hazeh. The mitzvah of Shavuos is only bidarabanan bizman hazeh. Now, why would that be? If you have two separate mitzvahs, okay, the Torah is mechayiv days, 50 days if you will. The Torah requires weeks, 49 weeks, 49 days, 7 weeks if you will, fine. But why would one be daraisa and one be darabanan? It would seem, based on the words of the Chizkuni, who seemingly has a similar distinction as well, that the mitzvah of the weeks the Chizkuni holds is not even a mitzvah called Yochid v'Yochid, but is in fact a mitzvah on Bezdin. Why would that mitzvah only be on Bezdin? It seems like these Rishonim are understanding, yes, there are two separate mitzvahs. There's a mitzvah of Yomim and there's a mitzvah of weeks, but the mitzvah of weeks is about the Karban. The mitzvah of Yomim is about Matan Torah. The mitzvah of weeks is about the Karban, knowing when to bring the Shtei Alechem. That might be just a mitzvah on Bezdin, says the Chizkuni. The mitzvah of Yomim every day, that's a mitzvah I'll call Yochid v'Yochid. That's about Matan Torah. That's about the Yom Tiv of Shavuos. So therefore, says Rabbi Yerucham, if I have a minyan of days and I have a minyan of weeks, and the minyan of days is about Matan Torah, that's still going to be Daraisa Bizman Hazeh, just like the Rambam says. If I have a mitzvah of weeks, which is totally on Karbanos, so that Bizman Hazeh is of course only going to be Midrabanan, just like the Tosfos says. So both the Rambam and Tosfos are correct. It depends which minyan you're talking about. You're talking about the minyan of the days, the minyan of the weeks. Well, now based on this Shita Rabbi Yerucham, we begin to have some insight into why perhaps there is no stira in our psukim, but we have to take it one step deeper. You see, we proved from Rabbi Yerucham that there's two separate mitzvahs: the mitzvah of Yamim, which is al kol echa ve'echa, the mitzvah Shuas, which machlokes Rishonim if it's on every individual. But the mitzvah of Yamim, we're arguing, is about Matan Torah, and the mitzvah, and therefore is deraisa bizman hazeh. The mitzvah of Shavuos is about karbanos, and therefore is only midirabanan bizman hazeh. You see, there's a very, very important distinction between these two countings in their very nature. Not just that one is counting towards Matan Torah and the other is counting towards Karbanos, but the very nature of the counting itself is different. You see, there are two reasons, there are two ways, if you will, that a person counts. There are two reasons that a person counts. Sometimes a person counts just to know when he's at the appropriate. I tell you, the bus stop that you have to take is 3 bus stops down. So you count, bus stop 1, bus stop 2, bus stop 3. I know it's the right one. The point of my counting is for one reason and one reason only: to know my goal, to know when I've reached that ultimate goal. But sometimes a person counts not only because I have to know when I reach the ultimate goal, but there's significance, there's chashivas within each and every single individual aspect over here. And I'm counting it not only because it's bringing me closer to the end, but it itself has its own significance, its own chashivas. I would argue that Chazal term these two types of countings quite differently. Sometimes they use the lashon of minyan, sometimes they use the lashon of svira. If you look at the Kadmonim, Rabbi Shapiro talks about this, Rav Hutner talks about svira is where you give a significance to the individual, and then you see the individual thing you're counting, and then you see how it all comes together into one whole. Minyan is just about minimizing the individual. I don't care about the individual number, I just need to get to the end game. Osir limnois Yisrael, it's osir to be moine Yisrael. Why? Because you're taking the significance away from the individual. So when it comes to different spheres, Rabbi Sai, there's a different nature, a different fundamental understanding of what a sphere is. When I'm counting just to know the end result, that's one type of sphere. That's what Chazal referred to as a minyan. When I'm counting because each and every part of this process has significance and I want to know what part of the process I'm in right now, so that's not merely counting to know when I get to the ultimate goal, but that's to know the significance right now. Well, what is Sfiras HaOmer? Lefi Rabbeinu Yerucham, I would argue, Rabbi say, that it depends. If you're talking about the counting to know when to bring the korban, so do I really care that today is day 2, tomorrow is day 3, the next day is day 4? No. That's why the Torah doesn't even say count days. Count the weeks. It's good enough to count weeks. Count 7 weeks, you're good there. At the end of the day, will I know when I'm up to the day I have to bring the korban? 100%. The point of counting weeks is merely to know when I reach the result, when I get to my final destination. I'm counting bus stops. But when I count days, is it important to me just to know when Matan Torah is? Or is it important for me to know that today is day 2 of the Omer, tomorrow is day 3 of the Omer? Each and every day has its own avodah, has its own avodah, this own way that I'm connecting, I'm the own part of the journey that I'm getting closer to Matan Torah. Today is day 3 is not only significant because I'll know when day 50 is. Today is day 3 because day 3 has its avodah and day 4 has its avodah, whether you go with the different avodas of the Mikubalim and the spheres, but we know, like the Chinuch tells us, Spheres HaOmer is about preparing. That means today has a preparation, tomorrow I build on that preparation, the next day I build on that preparation. It's not just about the final goal, but it's about every single individual step of the process. So the weeks is about karbanos, it's just about the goal. That's a minyan. The days is about understanding the significance of every single individual. So if I were to ask you, are we counting 50 days or 7 weeks? 49 days or 7 weeks? Why is the Torah seemingly soiser itself? On the one hand it says 7 weeks, which is 49 days. On the other hand it says 50 days. Well, the Torah, as the Rebbe Yerucham explained to us, is really talking about 2 totally separate countings. It's talking about the counting which helps us prepare for Matan Torah, and it's talking about the counting which helps us remember which day we're supposed to bring the Shtei Alechem. The counting for the Shtei Alechem is merely to know when the right day for Shtei Alechem is. So are we going to count the final day? No. I'm at my goal, I get off the bus. I'm at my goal, I bring the carbon. I just have to count 7 weeks to know when that time is, and therefore it's just 7 weeks. But when it comes to the counting of days, there it's to prepare myself for Matan Torah. Every day has an individual avodah. Every day is significant, not merely because of the end goal, because the day itself has significance. And therefore, do I count the day of Shavuos? Of course I count the day of Shavuos. This is the day I'm being Mekabel Torah. So yes, on the one hand you count 7 weeks, because the week counting is about the Karban. On the other hand you count 50 days, because the day counting is about Matan Torah. The week counting is about the Karban, is just about the result. It's a minyan, and therefore we're not going to count the end result. I know I bring my carbon 7 weeks, then I bring my carbon. But the counting of the days, the counting that's deraisa bizman hazeh, according to Rabbi Yerucham, that counting is not just about to know when the Torah is being given. If that were the case, 49 days, and the next day the Torah is giving, but it's about the avodah for the day. Shavuos has its own avodah, and therefore we count day 50, says Rabbi Yerucham, on Shavuos. And therefore, yes, the Torah could say you count 7 weeks and 50 days. It's not the same thing. 2 separate mitzvahs. One's counting the weeks, just about the result, 7 weeks. One's counting the day to know the avodah for that day. It's going to be 50 days. 7 weeks, 50 days. And that's what the Torah is telling us. Seemingly what's a contradiction. Really, if you unpack it properly, it's 2 separate mitzvahs with 2 totally separate yisodos, mitzvahs that we should be thinking about during this month to help us prepare us for Matan Torah. I wish you all a good night.